It had been 34 years since anyone had walked through the front gate of the old apple orchard I now called home. The trees, once neatly pruned by my husband's hands, had grown wild and towering, like the years I had kept hidden inside me. My name is Evelyn Winslow, and I am 72 years old. My cottage rests on the edge of Vermont, where fog hangs low and the nights whisper secrets. It's a place meant for remembering and, sometimes, forgetting. I came here after Harold died. He was the only man I ever truly loved. A quiet man, with calloused hands and deep-set eyes that saw through my stubborn silences. He passed away in his sleep on a Thursday morning 11 years ago. Just like that, gone. I didn't cry at first. The kind of grief that comes after a lifetime shared doesn't pour out all at once. It seeps slowly, like water through old wood. After the funeral, the children returned to their busy lives in Boston and Chicago, and I stayed behind. I painted the kitchen cabinets white. I learned to bake sourdough. I walked the orchard alone at dusk. At first I welcomed the solitude, it felt like devotion. But months turned into years, and devotion began to sour into silence. Sometimes I talked to Harold's coat, still hanging behind the pantry door. "You wouldn't like what I did with the hedges," I'd whisper, knowing how he'd always trimmed them with exact precision. I never touched the hedges again after he passed. They looked like grief, unkempt, determined. But it wasn't until the autumn of my 72nd year that the silence finally stirred again. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the sun pouring through the front windows in heavy gold, the smell of cinnamon from a simmering pot on the stove. I was dusting the mantel when the doorbell rang. Froze. No one had rung that bell in over a decade. Even the postman left things in the box at the end of the long gravel drive. I walked to the door with cautious feet, looked through the glass. It wasn't a stranger. It was a young woman, maybe late 20s. Long coat, red scarf. She looked like someone out of time. When I opened the door, she smiled like she knew me. "Are you Evelyn Winslow?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, my voice dry from disuse. "I'm June," she said. "My grandmother was Eleanor Jennings. You knew her." The name dropped into me like a stone into a still lake. Eleanor. My Eleanor. From college. My roommate, my confidant. My maybe. We had lost touch after graduation. I married Harold. She married someone else. I didn't know what happened after that. I never dared ask. "She passed 2 years ago," June said softly, as though reading my thoughts. "But before she died, she made me promise to find you. She said you'd understand." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The shadows moved like dancers in the moonlight. I hadn't thought about Eleanor in years, and yet, her presence now pressed close to my chest. June visited often after that. She brought old letters, ones I had written and Eleanor had kept. She brought photos too. A young me laughing in a garden, Eleanor behind me, arms half raised as if to catch me. There was one letter that stopped my breath. I never stopped thinking about that afternoon by the lake. Eleanor had written in careful script. "You said you had to go home for the summer, but I think you were scared." I was too. Maybe in another life. I pressed the paper to my lips and cried. Not because I regretted my life with Harold, but because I realized how much of myself I had stored away in forgotten drawers. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since 1982. I opened my art studio. It had been Harold's idea to build it. "A room just for you," he had said, hammer in hand, as I looked on with doubt. No cooking, no laundry. Just brushes and color. I stepped inside and was hit with the scent of linseed oil and pine dust. My easel stood in the corner, covered with an old sheet. I pulled it off like unveiling a secret. My first painting was of the orchard in winter. Pale, blue-toned, quiet. But in the corner, barely visible, I painted 2 women sitting on a bench, their scarves caught in the same wind. I painted every day after that. June brought me canvases. Sometimes she sat and watched me work, telling stories her grandmother had told her. Stories I was somehow a part of without knowing. Then, one evening, something strange happened. I was preparing for a bath. The windows steamed with heat. My robe hung on a hook near the door. I had just stepped out of my clothes when I heard a creak. Gasp. Who's there? I called out, wrapping myself in a towel. No answer. Only the faint scent of jasmine, the perfume Eleanor used to wear. My hands trembled, towel clutched to my chest, as I walked barefoot down the hallway. The door to the studio was open. Inside, the painting I had worked on that morning, Two Women Beneath Apple Blossoms, had a fresh stroke of color I didn't remember adding. Eleanor's scarf now glowed red. I didn't lock the door after that. Something had changed in me. Maybe it was Eleanor's voice, or June's presence, or the rediscovery of my hands. But I began to let life back in. I wore colors again. Not just grays and creams but bold pinks, mustard yellows. I let the neighbors' children come by to paint. I taught them to mix ochre and sea green. And one Sunday morning I stood in front of the mirror, wearing a dress with a neckline Harold would have raised an eyebrow at, and I didn't care. I wore it because it made me feel alive, visible. I walked through town that day, and for the first time in years someone stopped me and said, "You look radiant." I went home and cried, not from sadness but from recognition. I was still here, not just as a memory or a widow, but as Evelyn Winslow, a woman who had lived and lost and loved again, quietly. If you ever find yourself buried in silence, remember this. You can always open the door again, even if you locked it long ago.